Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know, we like to jump right into things here, and today we're tackling, well, a pretty crucial aspect of the whole entrepreneurial journey. And it's something that I feel like, I don't know about you, but it feels like it gets kind of glossed over in those those overnight success stories you always hear about.
Right.
It's the mental strain, the sometimes really intense mental strain of being an entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
And if you are here listening to this, I'm guessing you're someone who's, constantly pushing yourself. You're learning, you're tackling big challenges, and you probably felt that weight, at least a little bit.
Right.
Have you felt that?
Definitely. And I think it's something that a lot of people just don't talk about.
Yeah.
It's kind of the hidden cost of entrepreneurship. But when we actually look at the data, specifically when we look at the data on entrepreneurs, it really does paint a pretty stark picture. I mean, there's this really fascinating study by Dr. Michael A. Freeman.
Yeah.
And some of the findings there are quite sobering, frankly.
Yeah, they are. I mean, he found that entrepreneurs are twice as likely as the general population,
right,
to deal with depression. And then even more kind of more startling is that something like 1 in 3 entrepreneurs experiences depression or anxiety.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, it just gets worse the more you read about this, but entrepreneurs are 10 times more likely to show signs of bipolar disorder.
Right.
So we're not just talking about like the normal, stress of having a job or even like a demanding job. I mean, this is a unique environment, and it comes with some very, very real and very serious psychological pressures. Would you say that's fair?
Absolutely. And I think it's really important, especially for this audience, to distinguish between, we throw around this term mental illness and what we're calling mental strain.
Right.
Mental illness requires professional help, right? That's where you've got to go to the doctor. You need medical attention. Mental strain, however, that often stems from the unique demands, the unique circumstances of building a business. So that's what we're really talking about today, is like the situational stresses that come with this world. But as the research shows, if you neglect this strain, right, you don't manage it, it can lead to those more, serious and chronic conditions. So it's like there's a spectrum here.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's good to kind of have that distinction. So that's why we're taking this deep dive into what we're calling framework thinking today. And the way I kind of think about framework thinking is it's like equipping yourself with these mental models, and these structured approaches to systematically think about solving problems.
Right.
Because if we look at the data, it's clear that entrepreneurs, I don't want to say that we're bad at this, but it's not necessarily something that comes naturally to us. Would you say that that's fair?
I would definitely agree.
Okay. So framework thinking. So today, what we're really going to do is we're going to explore how this framework thinking can be a powerful tool to help us navigate and maybe more importantly, mitigate some of that entrepreneurial mental strain that we're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all about, having these frameworks to fall back on, right? To use in those difficult situations. Because when you don't have a framework, you tend to kind of spin your wheels and you get caught in that cycle of stress and anxiety.
Right.
But when you have these frameworks, it gives you a way to kind of break free from that. So framework thinking, at a high level, it offers a way to bring some much needed clarity.
But yes.
To complex situations. I mean, that's what we're doing, right? As entrepreneurs, we're dealing with these complex problems all the time. It gives us a way to organize the chaos that is just inherent in this world. Right.
And then ultimately it empowers you to actually make decisions and take action with greater confidence and with a clearer mind.
Yes.
And I think for someone like you, for this audience, people who really value efficiency and learning and who want to avoid feeling overwhelmed, this can be a game changer.
It really can be. And I think it's important. I want to say this now, and I also want to say it later, but it's really important for us to acknowledge that framework thinking, this is not a substitute for professional medical or psychological advice.
Right.
So if you are experiencing mental health challenges that are persistent, and they're really impacting your ability to function in your daily life, it is so important to seek help from qualified professionals. So therapy, counseling, medication, those things can be they can be absolutely critical, and they can even be life-saving.
Yeah. So what we're discussing today, this is really a set of cognitive tools that can work alongside traditional treatments to help bolster your resilience and help support your overall well-being. But it is not a replacement for professional help.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about giving you practical strategies to manage these situational stresses that are just inherent in entrepreneurship.
Right.
But always with the understanding that clinical mental health requires clinical expertise.
Right. Okay. So how are we going to unpack all of this today? We're going to delve into some specific frameworks, and we're going to see how each of those frameworks can address, I would say, probably some of the most common triggers of mental strain that entrepreneurs face. So let's just go ahead and kick things off by talking about that feeling of being completely swamped, you know?
Yeah.
When you lack clarity in your business, it's like, you know, you're wearing a million hats, you're juggling all these different things, you're constantly putting out fires. What does that feel like to you? How would you describe that feeling?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's such a common pressure point for entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah.
Because we are constantly juggling. We're juggling all these different balls in the air.
Yeah.
You know, we've got product development, we've got marketing, we've got sales, we've got operations, finance. It never ends.
Yeah.
And it's really no wonder that it can lead to this feeling of cognitive overload.
Yes.
Right. Your brain just feels fried, and that can trigger a lot of anxiety. It can trigger confusion. And I think one of the worst things it can lead to is analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
Where you just feel stuck.
Yeah.
You know, you can't make a decision. You're just frozen.
Yeah. And that's so interesting that you bring up analysis paralysis, because that is, I think, one of the things that a lot of really smart and capable people, that's kind of what trips them up, because they can see they can see the whole forest for the trees, so to speak.
Right.
But they're not able to actually like take a step back and see which path they need to go down, and they end up just staying in the same place. So if we think about this feeling of overwhelm, of just like everything's on fire, you know, we have to do this, we have to do that. What's a framework that could help bring some order to that chaos?
Yeah. So one of the frameworks that I find really effective here is the business model canvas.
Okay.
You know, a lot of people call it the BMC.
Okay, the BMC.
Yeah. So think about it as like a one-page snapshot of your entire business.
Okay.
Right. You're literally putting it all on one page. And what it does is it breaks everything down into nine interconnected building blocks. So these are kind of the core elements of your business. And it covers areas like, you know, your value proposition, what unique benefit do you offer to your customers?
Right.
Right. And then, you know, your customer segments. Who are you actually targeting? Your channels, how are you reaching those customers? Right. Your revenue streams, how are you making money? Your cost structure, what are your expenses? So it covers all these really essential elements of your business. Yeah. And by putting them all in one place, it really helps you to see the big picture.
Okay. So I get that, but I think a lot of people, or at least I know I've fallen into this trap where it's like, I know, okay, I need to figure out my customer segments, or I need to figure out my revenue streams.
Right.
But those things feel so big,
yeah,
you know, that it's hard to know where to start. So how does having this visual breakdown actually make a dent in that feeling? Like, it seems like it's just putting things on paper.
Yeah, so it's more than just listing things out, though.
Okay.
Right. By visually mapping your business in this structured way, the BMC, what it does is it takes all those abstract ideas and those worries that are kind of swirling around in your head.
Yeah.
Right. And it gives them a tangible form.
Okay.
And I think that's really important, because when you can see something, when you can visualize it, it becomes much less intimidating. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to focus on one specific element at a time.
Okay.
Right? Rather than feeling like you have to grapple with everything at once.
Okay.
So instead of feeling like, oh my God, I've got to figure out my value proposition and my customer segments and my channels and all of this stuff at the same time.
Yeah.
You can say, okay, you know what? Today I'm just going to focus on my value proposition.
Got it.
Right? And I'm going to really dive deep into that. And then tomorrow I can focus on something else.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's really cool about the BMC is that it makes the interconnectedness of all these different elements so clear.
Right.
You start to see how changes in one area might impact other areas.
Oh. Oh.
Right. So for example,
Yeah.
if you change your value proposition, that might impact your customer segments. It might impact your channels. It might impact your revenue streams. And I think that's something that's really easy to lose sight of when you're just kind of in the weeds, in the day-to-day of your business.
Right.
But when you have this visual representation of your business model, it all becomes so much clearer.
Okay. So you can see the interconnectedness, but then you can also zoom in and focus on one specific area.
Exactly.
Without losing sight of that overall picture. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So what kind of, I mean, this is all really interesting and it makes a lot of sense to me, but what kind of psychological relief does this actually provide? You know, like what's the kind of emotional benefit?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest benefit is clarity.
Right.
Clarity is such a profound antidote to confusion.
Okay, I love that.
When you can see your business model laid out in this logical visual format, that feeling of being lost in the fog, it starts to lift.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And then suddenly taking action feels less daunting because you have a clearer understanding of the steps involved and how they relate to each other. So the anxiety tends to decrease. There's a real boost in confidence that comes from having a structured understanding of your venture.
Yes.
It's kind of like having a map in unfamiliar territory.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so many entrepreneurs, I think this is one of the biggest, kind of hidden stressors of entrepreneurship is that we're constantly putting out fires.
Right.
Right. We're dealing with the same small flames over and over again instead of kind of stepping back and saying, wait a minute. Why are these fires starting in the first place?
Right.
Right. We're so focused on the symptoms. We're not focused on the underlying causes.
Right.
And this can be really damaging because it leads to a real accumulation of micro stress.
Right.
Right. You're constantly, you're getting hit with these little stressors over and over again.
Right. And they just build up. Yeah.
And it can lead to persistent frustration, chronic fatigue.
Yeah.
And even emotional exhaustion.
It's exhausting. It's draining. You never feel like you get ahead.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So is there a framework that we can kind of lean on to help us go from just reacting to these things to actually addressing their root cause?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where root cause analysis comes in.
Okay.
And there are a couple of really, really useful tools that you can use for root cause analysis. One is called the 5 whys.
Okay, 5 whys.
Yeah. And the other one is called the fishbone diagram.
Okay, that sounds very visual.
It is very visual. So the 5 whys it's a really simple but really effective method where basically every time you encounter a problem, you ask why.
Okay.
Right. Why is this happening? And then you ask why again. And you ask why again. And you do this, typically around 5 times.
Oh, okay.
It could be more, it could be less. But the idea is that you keep asking why until you get to the root cause of the problem.
Okay, so it's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Exactly. Yeah. You're trying to get to the core of the issue, not just the surface level symptoms.
Okay, I like that.
And then the fishbone diagram. It's also known as an Ishikawa diagram.
Okay.
Yeah, but I prefer fishbone diagram. It's a little more memorable.
Okay, fishbone.
Yeah. And what this is, it's a visual tool that helps you to systematically brainstorm and categorize the potential causes of a problem. Mm-hmm. So you typically group these causes under major headings like people, process, environment, materials. Yeah. And it creates a visual structure that literally looks like a skeleton.
Okay.
Hence the name. And this can be really helpful because it forces you to consider a much wider range of contributing factors.
Okay.
Right. It's not just about, this person made a mistake.
Right.
It's about, okay, what are the processes that might have contributed to this? What's the environment like? Are there any materials that are causing problems? So it really helps you to kind of broaden your perspective.
Okay. So how do these tools, how do they help us to break out of that really damaging cycle of just fixing the same things over and over and over?
Yeah. So the key here is that they help you to shift your focus from reacting to problems to proactively preventing them.
Okay.
Right. So instead of just putting out fires all the time, you're actually trying to figure out why the fires are starting in the first place, and then you're taking steps to prevent them.
Okay.
And so the 5 whys, That's really good for getting to the root cause
Right.
of a
That's right.
specific problem. And then the fishbone diagram is really good for breaking down these large, seemingly intractable problems into more manageable and understandable components.
Okay.
And so when you can break a problem down into smaller pieces,
Right.
it suddenly feels much less overwhelming.
Right. Yeah.
And then you can start to tackle those smaller pieces.
Yeah.
And eventually you'll solve the bigger problem.
Okay. And so what's the psychological impact of that? It's like you're not constantly putting out fires. You're not constantly feeling that stress. What happens to people when they're able to make that shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest impact is that you gain a sense of control.
Okay.
Right. Because you're not just reacting to things anymore.
Right.
You're actually in the driver's seat. You're the one who's deciding what's going to happen.
Right.
And that can be a really empowering feeling. And then the other thing is that it frees up your mental energy.
Okay.
Right. Because you're not spending all your time firefighting.
Right.
You can actually focus on the things that are important to you, on the things that are going to move your business forward. And that can lead to a lot more, peace of mind and happiness.
Okay. Now let's talk about something that I think a lot of entrepreneurs really struggle with, which is the uncertainty surrounding market fit. It's that question that keeps us up at night.
Yeah.
Is anyone actually going to want this thing that I'm building?
Right.
And I think this is a really big one because it can lead to so much anxiety, sleepless nights. You're constantly second guessing yourself. What have you seen around this?
Yeah. I mean, that's such a core vulnerability for so many entrepreneurs, right? Yeah. Because you're putting your heart and soul into something.
Yeah.
And you don't know if anyone's actually going to want it.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get really bogged down in self-doubt and second guessing.
Yeah.
And it can manifest in all sorts of ways. It could lead to anxiety, as you said, sleepless nights. It can lead to decision avoidance. You just avoid making decisions because you're afraid of making the wrong decision.
Right.
It could even lead to self-sabotaging behaviors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Right. Where you actually start doing things that undermine your own success.
Right.
Because you're so afraid of failing.
Right. Because if you fail, then it proves that those doubts were real.
Exactly. So it's a really tricky thing. And it's something that I think a lot of entrepreneurs, they just they white knuckle their way through it.
Yeah.
But there are frameworks that can help.
Okay, good. So how do we get out of that? Like as entrepreneurs, how can we gain more clarity and more confidence around what the market really wants?
Yeah. So one framework that I find really helpful here is it's called jobs to be done.
Okay.
A lot of people call it JTBD.
JTBD.
Yeah. And this is a really interesting framework because it kind of takes a counterintuitive approach.
Okay.
Right. So traditionally when we think about, market research and understanding our customers, we tend to focus on demographics.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Who are our customers? What's their age? What's their gender? What's their income level? All that kind of stuff. But JTBD says, you know what? That's not really the most important thing. The most important thing is to understand what job your customer is hiring your product to do.
Okay. When you say job, what do you actually mean by that?
Yeah. So when we say job, we're not just talking about the functional job.
Okay.
Right. So for example, if you're selling a car, the functional job of a car is to get you from point A to point B.
Okay.
Right. But there are also emotional and social jobs that a car can do.
Oh, okay.
Right. So for example, a car can make you feel safe.
Right.
It can make you feel stylish.
Right. Okay.
It can make you feel successful. So JTBD says, you need to understand all the jobs that your product is doing for your customers.
Okay.
Not just the functional job.
Okay. And how does that actually help with the anxiety, with the uncertainty around market fit?
Yeah. So when you understand the jobs that your product is doing for your customers, you gain a much deeper understanding of their needs and their motivations.
Okay.
Right. And that allows you to design a product that's really going to resonate with them.
Okay.
And it also allows you to market your product in a way that's going to appeal to them.
Okay.
Right. So instead of just saying, hey, we have this great product,
right,
you can say, hey, we have this great product that's going to help you achieve this job.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're not focusing on the features of the product, you're focusing on the benefits.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And that's really what people care about.
Right.
They don't care about the features.
Right.
They care about what the product can do for them.
Okay. I like that.
And so when you take that approach, you naturally start to feel more confident.
Right.
Because you're not just guessing anymore.
Right.
You're actually basing your decisions on a deep understanding of your customers.
Okay, that's a really interesting way to think about it. Now, we've talked about a lot of things that kind of come from within, the entrepreneur, but of course, businesses don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
There are all kinds of external factors that can really throw a wrench in things. We have market shifts, we have competition. There's all these things that are kind of that we don't necessarily have control over.
Right.
So how can frameworks help us to navigate that kind of that stress and uncertainty?
Yeah. So the inherent unpredictability of the business environment, that could definitely lead to a lot of stress.
Yeah.
Right. It can lead to decision fatigue.
Yeah.
You're constantly having to make decisions and you're just mentally exhausted.
Yeah.
It can lead to generalized anxiety. You're just worried about all the things that could go wrong.
Yeah.
It can lead to indecisiveness.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're afraid of making the wrong decision.
Yeah.
And it can just lead to a general sense of overwhelm. Right. You just feel like you're being bombarded by all these external forces that you have no control over.
Right.
So it's really important to have frameworks in place to help you to navigate that uncertainty.
Okay, so what are some good frameworks that we can use?
Yeah, so two frameworks that I find particularly valuable in this context are scenario planning and the risk matrix.
Okay.
So scenario planning is basically about thinking through different potential futures.
Okay.
Right. So you sit down and you say, okay, what's the best case scenario?
Yeah.
What's the worst case scenario, and what's the most likely scenario?
Right. Okay.
And then you develop action plans for each of those scenarios.
Okay. So it's like you're playing out these what if games.
Exactly.
Okay,
You're mentally rehearsing different potential futures.
Okay.
So that if one of those futures actually comes to pass, you're not caught flat-footed.
Right. You're not starting from scratch.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the risk matrix is a tool that helps you to evaluate different potential threats to your business.
Yeah.
So you list out all the potential threats.
Right.
And then you score them.
Okay.
Based on their likelihood and their impact.
Okay.
So how likely is this threat to actually happen? And if it does happen, how big of an impact is it going to have on my business?
Right. Okay.
And then you use that information to prioritize your risk mitigation efforts.
Okay, so it's kind of it's a way to kind of figure out where to put your energy.
Exactly.
Where are the biggest threats?
Yep.
And what are the most likely threats?
Exactly.
Okay.
And so by using these frameworks, what you're doing is you're taking that uncertainty, that feeling of the unknown, and you're turning it into something that's more manageable.
Okay.
Right. Because you're not just sitting there passively, worrying about all the things that could go wrong.
Right.
You're actually taking proactive steps to prepare for those things.
Right.
And that can make a big difference in terms of your mental state.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Now, running a business can also be, and this might sound counterintuitive, but it can be a really lonely experience.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of entrepreneurs who have really struggled with that feeling of isolation. So how do those feelings kind of manifest? Yeah,
so I think isolation it's definitely a major contributor to mental strain for entrepreneurs.
Right.
And I think it often goes unacknowledged.
Right.
Because we have this image of the entrepreneur as this kind of lone wolf.
Right.
Who's out there just, forging their own path.
Right.
But the reality is that entrepreneurship is a team sport.